Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Tuesday, November 25th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, a new center aims to modernize federal lending at a scale few realize exists. Plus, when a quarter of polluting facilities ignore the law, who's left to enforce it? Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. A new survey finds that nearly every service member living in privatized military housing has experienced serious problems in their home, and many of those issues go unresolved. The Change the Air Foundation recently launched the Safe Military Housing Survey, one of the most comprehensive efforts yet to collect data the Defense Department has never been able to track accurately. The nonprofit found that 3/4 of respondents were dealing with mold and microbial growth, which is extremely hazardous to someone's health. For more, Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis spoke with Erica Thompson, a military spouse and the military families liaison for the Change the Air Foundation, and Brandon Chapo, Director of Public Policy at the Foundation.
Just to give a little bit of back context, Change the Air Foundation, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We help families breathe safe indoor air and live in healthier homes. We focus on indoor air quality. A big component of indoor air quality and public health are water damaged buildings and mold. And Erica was passed over to us by another nonprofit organization in the space who said she and her family were really affected. She was an absolute warrior trying to get the word out, trying to be the voice and fighting for other families that were impacted by this. And so when we heard her story, we wanted to jump in and try to help because we were mostly focused on the civilian side of this, on the residential side of this, which is rampant, right? There's at least 50% of every home and building in the United States has some level of mold and water damage. So when we were hearing about the rates of exposure and the health impacts for our service members and their families, we were dismayed, we were alarmed, and we wanted to try to help. So this survey came as a result of trying to answer questions that hadn't been answered in previous surveys before, which were really important because we think that they were going to be able to better help Congress and help folks even at the Pentagon pinpoint areas that they needed to try to improve to help these families. So a couple of those aspects were, which Erica can speak a little bit more to, was the health implications, right? So we were hearing a lot of how many indoor air quality hazards and just housing hazards that these families were experiencing, but nobody was really ever asking, how is this affecting your physical health? How is this affecting your cognitive abilities? How is this affecting your mental and emotional health and your personal finances? And so that's a huge component of this survey, was able to get into that, which we were finding some incredibly dismaying numbers, right? I mean, we're seeing in the 40 percentile and 30 percentile of the participants, active service members, dealing with headaches and migraines and fatigue and brain fog and cognitive issues, various other issues within the household as well. So we thought that was incredibly important to cover for folks at the Pentagon and people in Congress who were asking us to do this survey. And then the other was trying to figure out where the gaps were in the current dispute resolution process, which is a 3-step process that was put together to try to give an off-ramp and a fair system to service members and their families to try to get these housing issues dealt with correctly. And I'll let Erica jump in here on that. But what we found confirmed our worst fears, which is that dispute resolution process is failing and isn't working.
And Erica, you and I previously spoke about your experiences. Could you one more time talk about those and how you got involved?
Sure. So we moved into military housing, and we just lived in military housing for 10 months. But as soon as we moved in, we noticed some issues with the home, the AC being one of them. And they said, look, we can't afford to replace your AC. So we did some things to try and mitigate the issues with humidity in the home. We had spent upwards of $6,000 trying to do those things. So dehumidifiers, we had 5 in our house. We bought pure air purifiers. We did as much as we could, and we waited for service calls to be done. And then they came and opened walls in our home. After about 6 months, they came to repair some of those issues. And we were seeing symptoms like crazy throughout our whole family, including our family dog. So he started having seizures, the dog, he was only 4, and he had great labs and he was in great health when we moved into the house. And then our son started passing out in the house, and it was within the same time period. And they opened the walls without any sort of containment or protection. And we saw an influx of medical issues after that point. And so 3 of the kids were diagnosed with asthma. 1 was diagnosed with bilateral pediatric cataracts in both eyes. So we had retina scans done before they opened the walls and then after, because he was passing out. And so he was also diagnosed with POTS. And so he's been passing out and having those episodes and just dysregulation with the nervous system. So we saw a huge range of health implications across the board throughout our whole family. And so I think using part of that, it was able to guide us through this questionnaire. Some of those things that I wish offices knew was able to really give me insight into making some of these questions, because we would share our story with congressional offices and they would say, how many more kids out there are there like yours? And I said, I don't know. There's no data around that right now. And so that was one of the main drivers for, we wanted to see how the kids were impacted, how the pets were impacted. You'll see there's even tracking for pet illness on here. And so that was really important because those offices wanted to know. And I think going through that personally, we were able to have sort of that insight as to some of those gaps and then what we'd like, to be able to share and highlight with other offices.
We'll get to those health implications in a little bit, but let's talk about the findings. The report says that nearly every service member living in a privatized military housing has experienced serious problems in their homes. 3/4, that is 78% of respondents, said that their family's health has been negatively impacted by their housing conditions, and nearly half said that a medical provider had confirmed that connection. What are the top issues that emerged from the study? What else did you find, and what does it tell us about the privatized housing model?
Out of a lot of the housing issues that we were asking about, mold, mildew, and microbial growth topped the list of hazards at 74%. So 3/4, essentially, of all of the participants were dealing with mold and microbial growth, which of course mold and water damage can be extraordinarily hazardous to somebody's health. I myself lived through that a number of years ago. That's what kind of got me involved in the nonprofit and advocating, because I just knew how terrible that the health effects of that were. So that's extremely dismaying. Temperature and humidity issues were found in over 50% of the homes. Pest infestations, water damage again, HVAC issues were over 50%, poor indoor air quality. So just the list goes on. And what we found was that, I think you mentioned 75 or 76% of the families had health conditions related to the housing, which half of those were confirmed by a physician. Here's the other really alarming stat. 47%, so almost half of the service members, active duty, right, who are out flying our jets, working on, the mechanics, out on the ground, out in the field, they said that their housing issues were causing them to be less mission ready, and it affected their ability to perform their duties. That is absolutely stunning. And so if anything underscores the importance of trying to get these issues dealt with, which of course we're trying to work on some solutions for that right now and putting those forward, it's the fact that, not only are our service members' health and wellness being affected, mission readiness, this is a national security issue, and we need to start talking about it in that light and start really framing it in that way, because it's that important. I mean, no military family should get sick just because they've decided to sacrifice and serve our country. And that's why we're trying to get this information out there and try to work on the solutions.
I think another key point too, Anastasia, is when we asked about readiness, we dove into the specifics. Where do you feel like it's impacting your readiness? And over 61% of the service members said mental health impact. And so that's cognitive, that's depression, anxiety. And when we talk about about the mental health of service members, that's a really important issue when they're in the service as well as when they leave. And so I think that's another alarming statistic that we need to dive a little bit more into as well.
Let's talk a little bit more about those health implications. What types of health issues did you find most prevalent? You also have a frequency of experienced health conditions by state. Could you highlight a couple of findings there?
Topping the list of the health findings were anxiety and mood changes. So a lot of emotional and mental and cognitive issues, insomnia, sleep disorders, headaches and migraines, brain fog, skin and eye and respiratory irritations, chronic fatigue, depression. I mean, and these weren't just in the low percentages. We're talking in the 20, 30, 40 percentages for some of these. So, which is extraordinary. I think that, and again, the list was a lot more extensive and expansive than that, but I just think just even those alone being as high as they are really should catch the attention of hopefully the country and, of course, those in Congress.
That's Change the Air Foundation's Brandon Chapo and Erica Thompson, the military families liaison for the foundation, speaking with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, when a quarter of polluting facilities ignore the law, who's left to enforce it? This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. EPA enforcement cases have plummeted, even as noncompliance rates climb. Now, a major staffing cut at the Justice Department's environmental section and a federal shutdown that paused inspections leave enforcement at a crossroads. Federal News Network's Eric White spoke with former EPA Deputy Assistant Administrator Stacey Geis about the resource drain crippling environmental enforcement and whether states can fill the widening gap.
You know, as far as EPA enforcement, environmental enforcement from a federal perspective, things were kind of on a downward trend already, and then with a slight bump, and now the first few months of the Trump administration, DOJ came in. The EPA was certainly on the list of agencies that they felt they could take some action against. What is the state of, I guess, federal environmental enforcement right now? Let's begin there.
Sure, and I think, Eric, you hit very well on sort of I think it's important to understand the context of your question, meaning what has the state of environmental enforcement been, say, for the last 15 years, generally, and the landscape we are in right now, which is back in I think it was 2019, but there was a report that was done by Cynthia Giles, who was head of the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance at EPA back in the Obama administration, and she went off to Harvard and did a report that showed that the level of significant noncompliance in the United States is surprising, and the numbers are that generally most facilities that have permits to pollute are 25% out of compliance. 25% of those companies are out of compliance with existing laws, regs, or permits, and that for the facilities that emit the most hazardous air pollutants, the numbers are up to 50-75% non-compliance. So I say it because you're starting from a place where we have more non-compliance than I think we would all expect. And of course, there could be a lot of reasons for that, including it could be laws that are tough to know how to comply with. But there's a host of reasons. But I say that because it's important to then put that into context of where we are now. Back during Bush administration, Bush 2, EPA was doing up to 6,000 enforcement cases a year. Those numbers, and then there was a very big decrease starting in the Obama years, and it just kind of kept going down, where they really decreased resources at enforcement for EPA's enforcement. And now, when the last administration came in and tried to revitalize EPA, hired hundreds of people, including in the enforcement division, and the numbers started going back up. But still, so in 2024, there were about 1,800 civil enforcement cases that were concluded. So now we are in the last 2025, what we've seen is two things. One, a reprioritization of this administration when it comes to what type of enforcement they want to do. And so a lot of folks who were, including the Department of Justice and the Environmental and Natural Resources Division, were on day one reassigned to do other things, including immigration. And then, of course, there was a whole host of terminations, administrative leaves, people who resigned, and then I think thousands who took the fork in the road. So we have an incredible resource drain right now at EPA. We also have it at the Department of Justice, which is obviously the partner that does a lot of the enforcement. So I would say where we are right now is that we will see in December. That's when EPA has to announce, or generally for the last 10 years has announced its enforcement results, its annual enforcement results, meaning how many civil cases were done, how many criminal cases, how many hundreds of millions of pounds of pollution were removed in the United States because of those enforcement actions. Those numbers will come out in December, and it will be very interesting to see what those numbers are compared to prior years.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the manpower aspect of this. What does proper environmental enforcement require? Does it need, a lot of attorneys, investigators? I imagine that these aren't easy cases to make, proving, causation and whether or not who is to blame for environmental pollution. That can probably be tough, given that there's no, it can be hard to obtain hard evidence. Can you just expand upon how, just having workforce cuts in general to environmental enforcement, whether it is EPA or DOJ, and the effect that just has on environmental enforcement in general?
Yes, and I will say also, there's federal enforcement. EPA does enforcement, DOJ does. There's also states that do that, and we can talk about that later in terms of how potentially whether we will see the states gap filling because of what we think will be a lack of federal enforcement. But going to your question, it is a whole team that exists to put together an enforcement case, and it starts with the inspectors. And those are also part of the Office of Enforcement. So you have inspectors who just routinely go out, it could be like any regulation, whether it's OSHA or, they go and they inspect the facilities for compliance. It starts there. And that's one thing, for example, that's paused during the shutdown is inspections are paused. So, but it's the inspections that then are one of the key ways that an agency finds out that a facility may not be in compliance. And then that starts then like you said, you may have investigators who come in and start investigating further. You have to have scientists, you have to have hydrologists, you have to have people who know air regulations, who can come in and ascertain whether or not is this really non-compliance? At what level? Is this something that rises to the level of an enforcement action? And if so, what kind of enforcement action? Is it something that it should be a minor fine and they're going to fix it? Or is it something that's lying, cheating, stealing, and they're being deceptively, bypassing the pollution scrubber, and you could be looking at a criminal case. So you have inspectors, you have investigators, and then you have all the attorneys who need to, both at EPA and the Department of Justice. EPA has its own enforcement program where they do those more minor, what we call administrative enforcement actions, where it's going to be a fine and course correcting and getting the company back into compliance. And then if it turns out the violations require a more serious enforcement, whether civil or criminal, it'll be referred to the Department of Justice. And those Department of Justice attorneys then bring the cases to court. So that's why the incredible drain we're seeing in resources at DOJ as well. And I can give you numbers on that, but the environmental section is down, I think, 50 to 60% of what it was in January, means, understandably, less resources to develop the case and less resources to prosecute the case.
We're speaking with Stacey Geis. She is a senior counsel with Crowell & Mooring, also former deputy assistant administrator at the Environmental Protection Agency. All right, so I wanted to, also you mentioned something in your first answer regarding how compliance could be tied to also it's really, really hard to be in compliance, right? Especially when you're operating a facility that is dealing with a lot of different chemicals. I mean, just forming compliance, sometimes the drain comes from the people that you're trying to enforce the regulations on just because they need that expertise in order to reach compliance. Is there enough compliance experts to go around? And also, how tough are these regulations to be in compliance? Are certain industries just going to always be having to deal with this?
Right. Well, Eric, that is a question we could have a whole day on that in terms of how one crafts good regulations that both are easy for the company to understand and comply with and easy to enforce. What I will say, though, is one of the challenges with the shutdown right now, because people are asking, what is the impact of the shutdown? It's not just, the industry is facing incredible uncertainty. And with the shutdown, what is paused, both at EPA and DOJ, are most enforcement actions. Criminal enforcement actions continue under their various shutdown plans, and it's always been that way. And there'll still be enforcement when it comes down to imminent and substantial threats to public harm or the environment. That is a very small subset. So right now, if you are a company and one thing that the Office of Enforcement does, it's called the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance, because not only does it enforce the laws, it's there to provide compliance assistance to the companies to help them. We want them to comply. We as a public want companies to comply, right? And we want to have agencies, federal or state, that are assisting them in helping understand those regulations so they can comply. Right now, I don't know if they called up EPA or, one of the regions, if they're going to get the person, because they're furloughed, to answer those questions. So one thing with this shutdown is not only is it mean that enforcement's not going forward, but there's a real uncertainty that the industry is facing right now too, in terms of their cases aren't moving forward. They can't get in touch. They may have compliance questions. They can't get answered. So it actually impacts anyone who is affected by environmental regulations, meaning affected by pollution.
And I wanted to ask, when you were in your position at EPA, how often were you all paying attention to those numbers? I'm just wondering about, sometimes we can get caught up in, well, the numbers increase, that must mean that everything is on the up and up, or, numbers are down, as you had mentioned. When they're severely down, something is definitely going on. But as far as, I guess, what was the push and pull between quality versus quantity there, as far as the number of enforcement cases that you all were actually pursuing? And, how did that factor into your analysis of whether or not you felt you were doing a good enough job or not?
Right. I mean, the question you want to address whenever you're doing enforcement is going after the most harm, right? And you have limited resources, and then any unlawful violation, but certainly one of like a public and health and safety regulation, which is what pollution regulations really are, right? Is how do you take these limited resources and best use them to enforce laws in a way that will alter behavior going forward of not just that company that may be out of compliance, but the entire industry. And so that is the challenge, and always the work you're doing is how do you use those resources effectively and efficiently? And so while numbers matter to some extent in terms of showing like exactly what cases are being done, how many inspections are being done, there's certainly a metric by which you want to use it to assess how your programs are going. You also are always often looking and doing a harm analysis. I mean, that's really the harm is focusing on which of the cases rise to the level of the greatest harm, right? That maybe a federal response could be needed versus maybe the state could handle it. So that is always the calculus. It's sort of this balance, right? So it's never that the numbers mean everything, but that's why you combine those numbers with, okay, so this is how many cases you prosecuted, this is how many civil cases you did. But we also, sorry, and I apologize, I'm still, sometimes I accidentally say we, EPA, only because I was there for a few years. I'm not, so I apologize deeply. But that's why when they bring the numbers, and that's why the December numbers will be so important, is to look at, they do things like the on-the-ground metrics. How much pollution was reduced, was cleaned up because of those enforcement actions, right? That's a good metric and one we're going to want to look at. Because again, the goal is to abate the harm.
I don't want to get you in any trouble, but I did, and you can talk as vague as you'd like, but I was wondering if we could maybe get some insight on a particular case. Who was your Al Capone? Who was your white whale that you were able to get one time? Like I said, you don't have to mention any specifics, but is there anything that you can recall of, just give us an insight into, what you saw one time and you were able to successfully get them either in compliance or successfully, prosecute any sort of criminal malfeasance?
I mean, I can certainly talk about the defeat devices and the sort of VW gate matters, which VW wasn't, that was where the company was intentionally altering the emissions control to allow the trucks or the vehicles to pollute more than the laws, regulations, and permits allowed. And that was $1 billion criminal civil case. VW was not the only one. So those cases were still going forward while in the last couple of years. And even in the last year, there was one against Cummins, which was, and this is public. I mean, it's a huge, they made all the Ram trucks. I think they paid over $1 billion. And then there was one against Hino, which is just a company that's public. It's a company, and that was a criminal civil matter where they were our call is a subsidiary of Toyota. But again, those are really big cases where you're really addressing a systemic issue. And again, bringing those cases, having very high fines, and even some of those cases being criminal, is hopefully is a deterrent to help and a message to other companies of, hey, if you're going to try to unlawfully alter the systems of your software in your cars to pollute beyond what is allowed, that there will be enforcement there. So I think that was almost like a bigger effort that went over years, but that was something that happened in the last couple of years that I think was, those were significant cases.
Gotcha. And finishing up here, we've seen the Trump administration decrease the resources in areas that they feel have too much government oversight in them. CFPB comes to mind. And what I'm feeling is that a major Supreme Court case is probably in our future of determining whether or not what an executive branch can do and what the threshold is. There are environmental laws that say the federal government is responsible for enforcement in this area. At what point do you deplete enough resources where a reasonable person can feel the government is not fulfilling that law? I just was curious about getting your thoughts on that, and if that is in fact in our future of some major case that may set the precedent for that.
That's a great question, and you hit on an important point, which is, again, as I noted earlier, a lot of our environmental laws that are federal laws have been delegated to the states to implement and enforce. Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, hazardous waste laws. And there's still a very vital role for the federal enforcement program. And there's a big reason for that. There's three things that need to happen. I mean, for a state, like a lot of the question has been, well, if federal environmental enforcement decreases, how, if at all, will the states step in to gap fill where there's non-compliance in their states and there's not an enforcement action? But three things you have to have, there's three issues with that. One, you have to have a state that has the resources to actually do those cases, including maybe the bigger ones. You need to have a state that prioritizes environmental enforcement. A lot of states are dealing with so many other big issues. It could be housing, it could be healthcare, it could be a lot of things, right? So you need to have a state that actually is putting resources and prioritizing environmental enforcement in their state. And then, like you said, there's several threats to the environment and public health that are not enforced by the states. And only EPA can do those, like pesticide registration, most enforcement in Indian country. And then there's certain Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act and hazardous waste laws that are only implemented by the federal, by EPA and DOJ. Coal ash contamination is a big one, which is that's a place where we see a lot of noncompliance. And so as a result, in 2024, EPA came out with a national enforcement initiatives, which is really to look at what are the biggest serious threats to the country that are there's so much significant noncompliance that it really could use a federal assistance, or it's in an area that only EPA enforces, not the states. Coal ash contamination was one of those. So you're right. So we very well will get to a place, and it'll be, again, I think these numbers in December will be really helpful to see what's happening. I think what we all care about is what's the on-the-ground impact to the people, right? We have tens of millions of Americans who can't drink their tap water, right? And that was another enforcement initiative, was really focusing on the community water systems throughout the country, thousands of which are often violating at least one health-based standard. And what is the efforts? And EPA had a whole program to not just enforce, but really provide compliance assistance to help those community water systems, right, be able to provide safe drinking water to Americans. That's where we'll want to look and see what are the impacts of this serious reduction in workforce, reduction in priorities, right? And then obviously some of these things the states can't do because they're not delegated to do it. And even if they did, do they have the resources and will?
Stacey Geis is Senior Counsel at Crowell & Mooring and former Deputy Assistant Administrator at the Environmental Protection Agency. She's speaking there with Federal News Network's Eric White. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, federal agency business forecasts have gone dark, and companies are struggling to plan without them. But first, a new center aims to modernize federal lending at a scale few realize exists. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The government manages a $5 trillion credit portfolio across more than 125 programs. And a new organization wants to bring technology, consistency, and integrity to that system. We'll explore the mission and vision of the Center for USA Lending with its founder, Doug Criscatello. Doug, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Great to be here with you, Terry.
You have big news. You've just announced the Center for USA Lending, and you're its first executive director. Tell us about this organization and why you decided to start it now.
Yeah, very excited to get underway at the Center for USA Lending. The idea has been building, really, in my mind, and the part of others from this community, the federal lending community, for several decades, really. The government, the U.S. government runs more than 125 federal loan and loan guarantee programs. And that's at agencies like the Federal Housing Administration, the Small Business Administration, the Department of Agriculture has a variety of loan programs, and various others. There's about a dozen federal agencies that have loan programs. And today, the U.S. government has evolved to a point where it's really the world's largest financial institution. Its credit portfolio alone now totals about $5 trillion, a huge number. So, given the relative complexity of making and servicing loans, and these instruments have terms that can last for decades, managing the government's this huge credit portfolio has always been a tremendous challenge, particularly when you compare it with simply providing a one-time cash grant to an intended beneficiary. That's pretty simple. You're just cashing once. When we loan money, we're entering into a long-term relationship with the borrower technically. So the complexity is very significant.
When you think about that massive portfolio, you said 125 different programs, 12 agencies, $5 trillion. Are there any specific programs that rise to the top of your visibility list in terms of desperately needing attention?
Let me answer that by talking about some of the good news. Because huge strides have been made in recent decades. We've come a long way from the days when loan repayments were recorded on 3x5 index cards and a pencil, right? So many of the systems that have been developed over the past few decades are huge advances relative to what we had sort of prior to the sort of general use of computational power across the government. But notwithstanding those advancements, the systems that we have today are fragmented, outdated, they don't communicate with each other. So this creates a whole lot of administrative complexity and borrower confusion. It drives up costs at the end of the day, and it makes it difficult to manage risk or detect fraud. And it generally frustrates borrowers. I think you could easily, if you did a man on the street interview, it wouldn't be hard to find folks that have been frustrated in repaying a loan to the government.
Well, your press release for the Center for USA Lending mentions modernization, technology, and integrity as core priorities. You just sort of glossed over them. But when I think about the financial industry, banking, and, major corporations, they're really at the front edge of technology, cybersecurity, identity management. How are you seeing the possibilities for bringing that kind of technology into how the government operates its loan portfolio?
Exactly right. So the government partners with a lot of financial institutions that are embrace modern technologies and are continuing to advance their use of sort of cutting edge tools like I think artificial intelligence is a terrific application here, right? To tailor the experience of borrower depending on their background, both in the application process and when it comes to servicing. And our hope is to really facilitate a dialogue, not only across the government, but to bridge the gaps that exist between technology, private financial institutions and what they're doing, and the U.S. government credit apparatus. Right now, there are huge opportunities to have really seamless systems from the time a borrower applies for a loan till the day they make the final payment. I think one of an agency that I've worked at and around for much of my career, the Small Business Administration, has made some amazing strides since the COVID pandemic, when it was forced to disperse, nearly $1 trillion in Paycheck Protection Program loans and economic injury disaster loans. They're in the midst of just an incredible improvement in the borrower experience, and sort of the disaster loan program being a great example. And we want to encourage that type of improvement to occur at other agencies as well.
I'm speaking with Doug Criscatello. He's the new executive director at the Center for USA Lending. Doug, coordinated technology investment is a perennial problem for the federal government, but setting that aside, you just described a situation that calls out for centralized governance, that calls out for data standardization. Beyond tech investment, what are your policy priorities for the center?
Yeah, well, you've touched on some of them for sure. The notion of trying to at least have a coherent approach across agencies, where we have common data definitions and agreement in principle that having these end-to-end systems are the way forward here. We really need to automate workflows and integrate systems. I mean, that's priority one, to ensure that can be done. So look, there's a lot that the center can do. We're going to be, one thing we're planning to do is to convene the community. Let's get folks, we plan to have frequent gatherings, so both from folks in government, folks in industry, to come together to explore, how best to move forward and to continually evolve. It's not a one-time fix. These systems can continually be strengthened. The government has shown no signs of reducing the size of its footprint here in the lending world. So, we want to be a convener. We want to develop thought leadership. We want to pull together data from across the federal lending enterprise into a common shared platform to help all of the participants in this realm better understand how these programs are performing and what we might do differently going forward.
You've laid out a pretty bold and expansive vision there. If you're successful, 5 years from now, what looks different about federal lending?
The stakes are really high now, right, with a $5 trillion portfolio. I think if we're successful, our work will help enhance taxpayer value, importantly, by reducing wasteful spending on duplicated systems. We hope to enhance program integrity, reduce catch fraud faster, and streamline access to loans, particularly when they're needed most, right? There are times when the federal government, and the pandemic was a great example, times when funds need to be put on the street quickly and effectively and efficiently in avoiding fraud. So our goal is really to make government lending more efficient. So if, whether you're a borrower seeking faster service, a private lender who wants to have a harmonized relationship across all of their various federal loan guarantee programs in which they participate, or even just a taxpayer, I shouldn't say just a taxpayer, importantly, a taxpayer who absolutely deserves efficient government operations. The center's modernization efforts, I think, are poised to benefit you directly. So we're really excited to get underway.
I've been speaking with Doug Criscatello, the new executive director of the Center for USA Lending. Doug, congratulations on standing it up. We'll be watching for your success.
Thanks so much, Derek.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, federal agency business forecasts have gone dark, and companies are struggling to plan without them. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Companies depend on accurate forecasts to plan bids and workforce, but some agencies have let these tools slip despite OMB guidance. Stephanie Castro, president of the Professional Services Council, is here to explain what's driving the gaps and to preview PSC's Vision Federal Market Forecast. Stephanie, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
This is an interesting time of year, not only the end of the calendar year, but the beginning of a new fiscal year and a lot of agencies under continuing resolutions. But it's also been a really tough year for the contracting community that PSC watches over. Tell us what companies are thinking about right now.
I appreciate the question, Terry, because you're right. It is the end of the calendar year, beginning of the government fiscal year. And this is the time of year when a lot of companies take a step back and evaluate their business strategy and their planning for the next few years. We see a lot of folks having offsites in December or in January to do some of this strategic planning. And I'll be frank with you, I think a lot of people will be happy to see 2025 end, and they will celebrate the new year in all sorts of ways just because of what they've been through this year. If your listeners can harken back to earlier this year, the efficiency initiatives really did a number on a lot of the business plans that had been developed among government contracting companies. Some of them had massive descoping of their contracts. Some of them had contract terminations. Some, particularly those who worked for agencies like the U.S. Agency for International Development and the Department of Education, some at Health and Human Services, really saw a diminution of their planned objectives throughout the year. And so as we go into the December and January planning cycle for these companies, what they're really looking for are signs from the government that there is work coming. As they start to think through what calendar 26 looks like, and they start to do their resource planning for personnel and for bid teams to put together proposals, that's really what they're looking for. And I will have to say, Terry, earlier this year, PSC, the Professional Services Council, we represent services and solutions providers. And typically every year we put together something called our business forecast, which looks at our scorecard, which looks at all of the web-based procurement forecasts put out by agencies. And we would look at tens of agencies and their forecasts, and we would rate them based on 15 key attributes, which we developed in industry, about what is useful for those forecasts. This year in 2025, we made the decision, instead of putting out our 7th annual forecast, we skipped this year. The forecasts just weren't there, and they're still not there.
How is it that agencies put those forecasts out, and what do they base it on? And I guess the third part of that question is, why aren't they there?
So this was a mandate from, among others, from the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, which is a White House office, that said, hey, agencies, to the extent that you can, put out forecasts on your websites. And it was really to help drive new companies to join the federal marketplace and to keep those companies that are part of the GovCon community interested, right? If you could look at a website and say, okay, there is an opportunity coming up in Q1, Q2, Q3, and let's build towards that opportunity. What happened earlier this year is a lot of those websites went dark. I think it was because as part of the efficiency initiative, it was no longer a useful tool because things were moving very, very quickly. What I find interesting, though, is that those websites are still dark. They're still not there. And so I'm not entirely sure how our government contracting community can put together a reliable business strategy for 2026 and beyond in the absence of that information.
Well, some estimates are that the contracting workforce itself has been reduced by over 25%. Are we just missing the people who used to do this?
I think that's part of it, Terry. We're missing some of the folks who took that deferred resignation or the fork in the road option. Some of them did the voluntary early retirement programs. I would also say in many agencies, and I'll use the phrase OSDBU, but I'll actually speak out the acronym here, the Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization. Those were usually the offices that had the lead on publishing these websites. And those offices have sort of been dismantled in some agencies. They are certainly de-emphasized in a lot of the agencies. And so it might be not so much that they're missing the people, that is true, but it's also they're missing the offices that had the lead on putting together these forecasts. And it really is a shame because business community uses these forecasts in so many different ways. It helps them I mentioned the business planning, but it helps them figure out who they want to partner with, who they're going to be, their subcontractors or their suppliers, their vendors, etc. And so this is a real gap in understanding of what the federal marketplace can offer companies. And I do think it will have effects on whether commercial companies want to get involved in government work. They just don't know what the opportunities are.
I'm speaking with Stephanie Castro, president of the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, one more question on this. I mean, GSA has gone through a lot of work to centralize procurement and forecasting. Would you expect that GSA will take this over perhaps and share their forecast?
So I love that you asked this question, Terry, because as I mentioned, the last time we put out our forecast, it was in 2024, and we had actually at PSC highlighted GSA as a model for putting out these forecasts. We mentioned that GSA has something called their acquisition gateway, which sets a high bar for government business forecasting, and it encourages the migration to the GSA tool for other departments. So Department of Labor, Department of Justice, they were using the GSA acquisition gateway. So I think this is a fantastic opportunity to go back to that gateway and have GSA take the lead.
Speaking of forecasts, PSC's got a big session coming up starting on December 1st, your Vision Federal Market Forecast. Tell us about that.
Terry, I have to say, I love that our entire segment here is devoted to forecasting because the procurement dork in me is celebrating here. So PSC has this conference, and it's actually run by our foundation, which is our 501c3 nonprofit affiliate dedicated to education. And so it is a year-long process where we have so many teams come together. There are 21 different study teams. They focus on things like health and human services or customs and border protection as part of the Homeland Security team. And this year of agency discussions, they speak to think tank folks, they speak to procurement officials within the government, and it culminates in this conference, and it happening in person on December 1st. It's a virtual day for December 2nd and 3rd. It is where these 21 different study teams present their findings. So it's not just tied to a web-based procurement forecast, but rather these discussions that they're having with officials. We had over 400 volunteers as part of this process, and I'm just very excited. It is a great opportunity to really hear what's going on in the procurement world, not just for opportunities, but what the dynamics look like, what impact inflation is having, et cetera. And to be honest, what impact these efficiency initiatives have had on the federal marketplace. So I highly recommend this conference. Again, it's December 1st through the 3rd, and December 1st it's the only in-person day here in Arlington.
It sounds like in the absence of the agency forecast that we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation, this may be a great opportunity for contractors, those who are considering government work, to find out, at least from inside sources, what's going on.
It's a perfect opportunity to get some business intelligence. It's also a great networking opportunity because we do have government folks come to this conference as well to hear about what other agencies are doing. And so I highly commend it to folks who are listening, but I'm certainly going to be there and soaking up all of the knowledge that I can.
Can you preview a little bit of any specific sessions you're looking forward to?
So I'm particularly looking forward to the Defense Services presentation. And I always look forward sort of to the top line and the IT modernization teams as well. So if I were going to recommend 3 sessions, those are the top 3. But they're all very, very interesting, and I'm really looking forward to it.
How do people who want to attend find out about it and register?
Thanks for asking. They can go to pscouncil.org, and you can also search for Vision Federal Market Forecast, and the sessions will pop up. There is a fee, obviously, for this, but it is open to the public. It is a widely attended gathering, which allows government folks to attend, and so that is how they can connect with this conference.
I'm speaking with Stephanie Castro. She's president of the Professional Services Council.
Thanks, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. When it comes to getting spare parts for military systems, it's not always as easy as simply placing an order. Sometimes the original manufacturers no longer exist, and sometimes wait times are excruciatingly long. That's one reason the Navy wants to make the best use it can of the materials it already owns. A new effort by Naval Supply Systems Command aims to help do that by reusing as many items as possible from decommissioned units, instead of sending them away for disposal as surplus property. Robert Medina is the Deputy Director for NAVSEP's West Coast Consumable Asset Reutilization Program, and Doug Murphy is the Material Management and Warehouse Utilization Product and Service Lead. They talked about this problem with Federal News Network's Jared Serbu. Murphy speaks first.
NAVSEP Weapon System Support, has all these potential units that can offload, and units are both afloat that are carrying these aviation consumables and those ashore stations. They will take a look at their inventory profile and they'll run it through a program that is screening them for demands that they've had and any potential future demands that they may need. And that'll give them a result based off of what that entire profile is of things that need to come out of their inventory and go into this CART program so that, the Navy and the Navy Working Capital Fund can gain additional visibility and availability from other units. And to kind of clarify that a little bit is most of the time, and there's a little bit of, not always the case here, but the majority of the time when that material is attached to an afloat unit or an ashore station, it's kind of locked in. There is a sourcing wheel, that can do lateral support, but for the most part, those are attached to that station to support those platforms on, aircraft or what's aboard that ship. Once it comes out and goes into CART, then it has much broader visibility from all naval forces.
Yeah, and I'll give you an example of the trends that we're seeing. So when we first started this offload program, a lot of material, as you said, is locked in. And so when we started receiving this material into our warehouse, it was completely visible. And so we would have a scenario where we would post the material into our warehouse, and not even an hour later, a back order would fill that requisition, and it was going out that same day or next day.
One thing I wonder here is that, there's some pretty logical cost savings, I would imagine, here in just in the fact of preventing the Navy from needing to make new purchases for items that it otherwise would be buying from the market. But do you also have cases where you're able to recover and make available items that the Navy couldn't buy if it wanted to? In other words, things that are no longer manufactured or the OEM is out of business, et cetera. I don't know if you have visibility into what you've made available down to that level, but is that the sort of thing that you're running into?
I would imagine that is definitely a possibility. I haven't seen any data that shows, the not available but filled from CART. But yeah, definitely, like you said, it's definitely a possibility that
I know it's happening. Because, as I said, there's a lot of back order demand for stuff that hasn't been filled. Industry hasn't been able to fill that demand. It hasn't been contracted out. And so when we see those where it gets checked in and checked out on the same day, those are what we're talking about where, there's a backlog and industry can't fill it. And those are the ones that are going out and filling those requisitions today.
What would you all say have been some of the biggest enablers to the successes that you've had recently? And that could be anything. I mean, is it a new IT system or support from leadership? What has it been that has allowed this program to be so successful recently?
From my perspective down here in San Diego, it's really Robert's team, him and Lieutenant Commander Copeland up in Ventura County, running this whole team and getting this CART process off the ground, up and running up at Port Hueneme. They've very organized, very just kind of forward-leaning into the possibility and what this could do for the Navy. So I think from a leadership, management, and an overall team involvement from all the folks up there, I think has made this a very successful endeavor from the West Coast. And it's not, it's not perfect. There's still things that can be tweaked and improved, just with, organizational structure and some things like that we continue to work on, and maybe some process improvements and things like that. But for the short amount of time that we've been running from the West Coast, I think they've done an excellent job up there.
I think my biggest enabler was a commanding officer that we had prior to our current one, Captain Corey Shem. He came out here for a site visit, and he laid eyes on this warehouse facility, which is pretty new and standardized for current warehousing across the Navy. And there was a lot of real estate up here, a lot of opportunity. And so he pitched the idea because he knew about the CART program more than what we did. And so with that idea, he started it all and said, hey, we want to run this program from Port Hueneme. How do we stand this up? And it was about a year-long process where we had to kind of go back and forth and saying, hey, can we do this? Do we have a proof of concept? And we did, right? We started with a small offload of a local unit here in Port Hueneme that was offloading, that was going to dermo a whole bunch of material. And we started with that. And we proved right away that, hey, it can be done out of Port Hueneme. Having the team up here who was able to, like Doug said, lean into that and do what we do seamlessly, it helped out a lot. And it proved to leadership that we can do it. And that's why we set up the West Coast CART.
And Robert, when you talk about offloading a unit, tell folks a little bit more about what a unit can be. I mean, can that be anything from an aircraft carrier to a shore unit and everything in between? Or what do you all typically tackle when you go to a unit?
Exactly. It could be anything in between. So I'll give you a couple examples of offloads that we've done so far. We started off with our first one, which I mentioned was a local unit. They were an expeditionary command, part of the CB battalions here. They had excess material that they no longer needed. And a lot of it got screened. And I would say about 20% of it was still valid inventory that there was a demand, and we were able to offload it. Our next offload was the USS Tripoli. That was a CVN. We've done air stations such as NAS Lemoore. We've even gone as far as smaller units like the LCS ships, littoral combat ships, and Marine Corps, Marine Aviation Logistics Squadrons as well.
That's Doug Murphy, along with Robert Medina from the Naval Supply System Command's Consumable Asset Reutilization Program, speaking with Federal News Network's Jared Serbu. We'll post their full interview at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Standiford. Our web editors are Daisy Thornton and Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.